Welcome to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'm your host, Charles H.F. Davis III, and we are thankful to be joined in conversation today by comrades and colleagues working to reimagine post-secondary institutions and a world without police. First, I would like to welcome Christopher Rogers and Jake Nussbaum, both of whom are graduate students and organizers with Police Free Penn, an abolitionist assembly affiliated and seeking affiliation with campus and community stakeholders committed to ending institutionalization of the police state at the University of Pennsylvania and the historic Black Bottom. We're also joined by Alejo Stark, graduate student and organizer with the Graduate Employees Organization, a longstanding union representing graduate student instructors and graduate student staff at the University of Michigan. Comrades, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I'm really excited to get into our conversation today. All of you have been engaged in some tremendous and important work over the last few years, which sort of begs the question of how your organization both sort of formed and is developing, and the decision to address issues related to campus safety and security.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it for Police Free Penn, and Jake, help me out. Really, the birth of Police Free Penn is in June of 2020. And it's sort of like a confluence of two events that were happening and us attempting to figure out what this means. One event, so this is like post the George Floyd uprising, there's a petition that is being made. Some faculty and graduate student representatives, it's called Penn Against the Police State. And it's sort of names ways that Penn is complicit within the sort of like policing and prison industrial complex, and that we need to do something about it. This goes on to change.org. I want to say in about a week and a half, it had amassed over like 12,000 signatures. That's one of the events. The other event, which is sort of like more grounded in what's happening in Philadelphia, is May 30th or 31st of that year. The resistance on 52nd Street is attacked by the Philadelphia Police Department. And you see, rubber bullets and tear gas going everywhere. Yes, it is a main business street, but certainly a lot of residential homes all around that. You have families who are, having to like flee their homes for chemicals like safety of their children. And we recognize that, not only is University of Pennsylvania's police there and helping to like suppress the mostly Black community there on the 52nd Street corridor, but you have like Drexel Police and SEPTIS Police, which is our transportation, police. And we realize that beyond just the sort of like ways that we were like in this abolitionist community of Philadelphia was recognizing the need to defund the Philadelphia police. We also have all these para-police, private police forces that are going around the city. So it also begged the question of what is our responsibility as members who are affiliated with this institution? Like, how are we accountable to this overall movement that's being led by Black Philadelphia and this sort of like wider struggle to realize abolitionist world? So that those two things coming together, both the challenge of like the internal institutional dynamics and the ways that Penn reproduces structural violence, and how that is protected by policing as the mechanism, as well as what is our accountability to the abolitionist movement around us, and how can we leverage, still do what we can to support resourcing that movement, and what does it mean to express solidarity? So how you feel about that, Jake? Did I get most of it?
Yeah, I feel great. I'll just add, like, from a nuts and bolts kind of pragmatic perspective, about 10, like Chris said, like 10,000 people signed this petition, which called for the divestment of Penn's endowment from the prison industrial complex, which is just amazing to think that there was a month of a year that we got 10,000 signatures on something like that, a document like that, right? It also called for the disbanding of the Penn police force. And someone who worked on that petition, I wasn't one of the people that worked originally on that petition, but the people that worked on it, like, basically emailed everybody that signed it and said, like, if you sign this, get on this Zoom call. Like, literally, like, that's how it worked. Like, that's how I got added to it, and I got added to a Zoom call, or maybe I got added to a Signal thread that had like 500 people, and then that Signal thread picked out a Zoom call. And basically, we all kind of like got a chance to see who one another was that had signed this, and what we realized was that it was undergrads, graduate students, faculty members, community members that have, like, no direct affiliation with Penn to speak of. It was employees, it was former employees, it was alumni. And so we all kind of like looked at each other and basically, like, almost, I would say, spontaneously just started coming up with strategies to do the kind of work that Chris was talking about. Like, how can we support this abolitionist movement that's happening in West Philly? Like, let's literally like break out into some Zoom groups and start talking about it. And we were fortunate to have people who had, like Chris, like some of our other, really important founding members, like Crystal Strong comes to mind, people who had really deep roots in organizing work to kind of show us the way. But it really was a moment of sort of like, we're going to sort of improv a little bit and figure out how to do this. And then that was, at this point, 2.5 years ago. And it kind of evolved from this sort of big open-ended project with many, many hands on deck and hundreds of people kind of paying attention to what might resemble now more of a like a typical organizing group where there's like 30 or 40 of us who are actively meeting, who are coming up with projects and agendas and working groups and campaigns and that kind of thing. So what we look like now is a little bit different than what we looked like when we got started, which says also a lot about that historical moment and how we got going and how we ended up here.
Absolutely. So I definitely want to get into sort of the evolution and development, because as you're speaking, right, there's a lot of overlaps with a number of things that I know that Police Free Penn has been actively engaging in. And we definitely want to talk about what's been happening with the townhomes. Alejo, I want to bring you in here. Given my sort of arrival to the University of Michigan was actually at this exact same time. And I remember that GEO was on strike, pending sort of negotiations. But what was interesting to me was seeing sort of that list of demands in which there was actually like a component of policing demands, which if I'm not mistaken, was also sort of in concert with the Students of Color Liberation Front and the things that they were sort of working for. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about sort of like why GEO decided to take this up, given that it was like right, sort of in the space of negotiating. And I can imagine that, that would only make negotiations harder with an institution when now this is also on the table. Could you talk a little bit about how GEO kind of came into this work and the development of the abolitionist working group?
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to talk with comrades about this stuff. It's kind of bewildering. It's been sort of two years since the uprisings, and that here we are, right? And trying to build since then. Things have changed, and so trying to keep the flame alive and being true to what happened that summer, right? And the massive uprising, the burning of the third precinct. So I want to kind of like also foreground that as that's what I think about all the time. Like, how do we keep fighting in a very different situation today, right? So what was happening then was that we had just come out of a very fiery summer, a very mournful but also joyful summer. And the university had refused to bargain with us, us being GEO 3550, which is, as you said in the beginning, is a union that's been around since the 1970s, since 1975. And we had actually not gone on strike since 1975 either, to be honest. So it's one of the kind of a historic strike for that reason as well. We had entered what's called impact bargaining, because over the summer we had just agreed to a contract in April of that year in 2020, before the uprisings, and before COVID, basically right around that time. And the university proposed some reopening plans that were awful, right? We weren't going to get tested. We were basically, they were calling for a safe opening that was not safe at all, right? And so we articulated a set of demands that called for safe and just pandemic response, a safe and just campus for all. And I think what that allowed us to do was to kind of disarticulate, disentangle, right? The conflation, the kind of ideological common sense notion in which we think about safety and security, right? Even the police department here is called the Division of Public Safety and Security, right? So in some ways, we confuse safety with security. I mean, this is something that longtime abolitionist Stevie Wilson, who is being held captive in Pennsylvania prison, says all the time, right? He mentions in one of an interview I did with him on Rust Belt Abolition Radio that, here I am locked up behind bars with security cameras, right? And I am secure, but I'm not safe, right? And so I think our strike tried to precisely think about safety and justice, and sliding away security. And we asked for a defunding of the police, 50% defunding of the police, cutting ties with ICE. And we articulated that with COVID demands, like we wanted to get sort of randomized testing, the basic things that we have now in the wake of the strike, or we had at least in the wake of the strike then. And I got to say that there's a long sort of story I can tell about the strike, and maybe we can talk a little bit about later. But the way we got there is not, we kind of stumbled onto it in some ways because of the situation, because of the conjuncture, because of the forces at work at the time, and because of the university's intransigent kind of inability to negotiate with us. But I got to say also, there's a long history of abolitionist organizing within GEO. In 2014. Ara Rosser, a Black mother and an artist, was murdered by Ann Arbor police on November 9th of 2014, right? This is around the same time that, the Ferguson uprisings, the Ferguson non-indictment, right, is happening. And here it is, this woman who calls the police, her partner called the police in a domestic dispute, and Ann Arbor police show up, and within 3 seconds, she literally, her heart is literally broken, right, with a bullet. And so at that time, a lot of GEO members, including Austin McCoy, some of you might know, Mariam Assis, and other comrades, and a broader group of friends and comrades kind of organized around an organization called Ann Arbor Ferguson, which then turned into Ann Arbor Allies for Black Lives. And the GEO was the space where we met, where we talked, where we organized around many of the marches and some of the things that came in the wake of that, including getting some money for Ara's children, right, and fighting for Ara's for the justice and the memory of Ara Rosser. So there's a long history to organizing within abolitionist organizing within GEO, and there's a close link between campus police and the Ann Arbor community, including the fact that John Cito, who was the chief of police at the time Ara was murdered, actually was hired by the university the year after, right? And Officer Reed was actually promoted to the rank of sergeant, who was the officer that murdered her, right? And so he's still on the force. David Reed is. And John Cito now works for the campus police at the University of Michigan, right? So those links are very real for us, right? And while it was the first time that we went on strike for this, this also came in the wake of being very much kind of inspired by the comrades in the UC system, the UAW 2865, who through their so-called racial justice platform brought anti-policing demands to grad student unions around that time, right? So we were very much inspired by that, and in 2019, we brought that also up as a bargaining, as something that we wanted to bargain over, fight over. We wanted to disarm and demilitarize campus police, but unfortunately, sort of membership was not on board at the time, even though leadership was, and through reasons I can talk about later, it was deemed to be a non-permissive subject of bargaining, which is kind of a technical term for you don't get to bargain over everything. Of course, that's historical and that can change. But that was dropped at the table in 2019, 2020. And then the George Floyd uprising happened, right? So, and here we are in the fall of 2020 with these awful reopening plans, with a history of organizing within GEO, within Washington County. And I think folks try to do the best they could at the time and enjoying these two demands. And I can talk a little bit more about the strike, but that's how we got to the strike, which is when you arrived there, right, Charles? Yeah. That's kind of the sort of lead up to and the short history behind that, that strike and how we got to that point.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think both of you all, in terms of your groups, right, are talking about this not being a new thing. And I think that's really important for folks to understand,
Mhm.
right? I think the idea that, like, oh, post George Floyd, now everyone's talking about it. And it's like, well, folks have been doing abolitionist organizing as long as the country has existed, right? And we can sort of make that historical trace. But thinking about the abolition of chattel slavery specifically and all the work that had been happening, both in the light and the dark, right, by enslaved folks to fight for really a new world, right? A new existence, one that wasn't going to leave them in the conditions that they had been forced into for so long. And even within higher education, right, there's a long sort of legacy of abolition, even for those who were stakeholders also fighting for and on behalf of the abolitionist cause at places like Lane Seminary and Oberlin and some of these other institutions. And I think that's a really important note for folks, right? This is not new because the issue still persists and perhaps it's growing and getting worse in a bunch of ways that I think we'll kind of get into with regarding surveillance culture and how technology is being moved in a particular way. Even with Zooms, right? And the way that that's been sort of weaponized and students being a part of that process. So, in thinking about that, I want to kind of return to this relationship between what we call like the town and gown, right, or campus and community. And you both sort of alluded to the permeability of those boundaries and the extent to which like policing as an apparatus and a set of organizations have like this overlap where they're sometimes working outside of what we would consider their patrol zones, right, and are engaging in types of activity. And I wonder if you could speak to how that shaped the way that you approach organizing that isn't sort of specific to campus, right? So as someone who studies student activism, one of my sort of concerns is that we have like this hyper focus of just what happens on campus and just almost in like the formal ways of doing politics. That isn't actually how we see it play itself out in the field. And so I wonder if you could speak to, again, sort of how policing provides sort of a set of intersecting and overlapping interests with community, but then how you've been able to organize within and across those boundaries that institutions work really, really hard to kind of keep firm.
Mhm. Just a quick note. We mentioned a comrade, Stevie Wilson. Stevie Wilson is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. And through a call, we got to talk. I would almost say an honorary member of Police Free Penn. So shout
Shout
out to
out Stevie
Stevie.
Wilson.
And yeah, so I would say, and kind of, and I'm still reflecting on our origin story a little bit, is that the Black Philly Radical Collective in Philadelphia, which is made up of a number of longstanding, Black-led radical organizations, um, the Mobilization for Mumia, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, BLM Philly, um, the MOVE organization, the Abolitionist Law Center, and many others. Black and Brown Workers Cooperative was part of that. So they came together and they put together this blueprint in the midst of seeing, and I think everyone can sort of like speak to this, like in the midst of the outpouring after George Floyd's televised sort of like murder. You Everyone was like, what is the demands? How do we bring this together? So this organization, this collective, this coalition, Black Philly Radical Collective, put together this 13 demand document in the war on Black Philadelphia now. And that the presence not only of that document and the ways that they were elaborating on this is the opportunity of this moment, and this is what we need people to get behind, but also their long-standing organizing presence within Philadelphia really grounded our organization. And it almost like I don't Jake probably, but the privilege, right, of being able to enter alongside, Crystal Strong, who was, also part of Black Philly Rock, being able to have that ongoing dialogue, right, about how do we match our approach, our demands, our direct actions within this much larger umbrella of what it means to build an abolitionist Philadelphia.
Mm.
So like from us, as we were even thinking about how we framed our manifesto, it was about that, right? About letting folks know, and importantly, and I think as Jake mentioned earlier about the diversity of, where people's stance in Penn was, right? We have, undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty members, staff members, alumni members. And the fact that we could all pull people together and say, yes, we're here and we're affiliated with this institution, but also our vision must be in alignment with
Mm,
with what's happening here. So it was able to sort of like, there's of course always those power dynamics within institutions, but it also called us to think outside of that and say, well, how do we like recognize that we are have a responsibility to the community too, and that allows us in some ways to kind of drop our titles and realize that yes, we are battling against the administration, the president, the head of public safety, whatever, but also we're in community with folks who are thinking of how we change Philadelphia, how we change the state, how we change the nation, and particularly and for a lot of the actors of the Black Philly Radical Collective, they're thinking transnationally as well. So it's like that sense of grounding really gave us an, a way to just think beyond the institution, to
mm,
not let our demands or the denial of our demands be the end of what we think organizing and building power is. So I certainly, felt that as we put together what we wanted to do. And then in that way, the university becomes a site of struggle where we can
mm,
like practice different experiments in this sort of like, bounded space and say, all right, let's see what happens if we do this. What type of tactics, what type of response happens if we go this way? And then
mm-hmm.
it becomes this way that we can kind of like practice out ideas and channel those lessons right to the larger community at the same time delivering, tangible material resources. So I'll just pause there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Chris. And it kind of brings up for me this idea that has been discussed as the perception, at least internally, right, is that like the university is what we consider the domain of solutions, but society is considered the domain of problems. And part of what you're sort of articulating, right, as organizers is like, well, actually, like the people do got the answer, Sway, right? Like we've already have this sort of immense resource in places like Philly, but also in places like Ann Arbor, where organizing has been there before we've arrived, and it will certainly be there after. So part of what I'm hearing is, the intention and the importance of making sure that that relationship is right between organizers who are mostly framed as advocates, right, sort of in the community space, or in the campus space rather, on behalf of community, but saying like, actually, no, we're trying to hold and make sure that there is space for community folks here, because the university, whether it likes it or not, is actually a part of this community and can and should be in right relationship, right? So how do we use that in ways that the community can kind of dictate? And we see that long history, particularly with organized, right? We talk a lot about in these meetings with Police Free Penn, right? The 1967 sit-in, and sort of that as a big catalyst for a lot of the work that's happening now around issues of gentrification. But somebody like, say, Walter Palmer and his like consistent presence, although right, polarizing figure in some regards in some spaces, but nonetheless has been present since then. And we know that he and others like the Philadelphia chapter of the Black Panthers had an intricate role in shaping what would be advocated in that sit-in as much as it does for the work that's been happening now. So I really, really appreciate that. Jake, Alejo, anything that you all are thinking about as kind of Chris was talking about those relationships and even how it shaped your own perspective on organizing in this moment?
I mean, I could just add a couple quick thoughts about this idea of like a kind of like the university as a bounded space. I mean, I went to a small liberal arts school in the Northeast that had like 2,000 people, and it kind of was more of that presentation of a classical town and gown. Of course, those categories have their problems, but I just want to give like for the listeners, a sense of the scope of the University of Pennsylvania, because it's the it has the largest private police force in Pennsylvania and of 120 officers. It's the largest employer in Philadelphia. It has 40,000 employees. It's the largest landholder in Philadelphia. Crucially, does not pay taxes on that land, right? So does not actually support the city through taxes or the public schools through taxes, right? It has 20,000 students, so that's like roughly 60,000 people, and that has an endowment of $20.7 billion. So it hoards a tremendous amount of wealth within the space of Philadelphia in a very small, through various investments in their endowment. So I mean, just that sense of perspective also for me helps break some of this mystique that the campus is somehow like a separate space from the
Mm,
city, right? Like how can something with that much power be said to not be entangled with every other aspect of Philadelphia and the lives of Philadelphians, right? And there's all these different ways in which the campus and the university as an institution reaches, off campus, right? They selectively fund certain public schools to stimulate the gentrification of select neighborhoods so their professors can move in and boost property values in those neighborhoods. They buy up huge amounts of land and let properties on that land decay over the course of 10, 20 years, and then create what they call a business improvement district to encourage new developers to come in. That increases property values in that area. As Chris mentioned, they send their private police force to support when there's a mass civil uprising in West Philadelphia. They send their police officers to join in the repression of that protest. So, I heard Ruthie Gilmore somewhat recently speaking at the Free Library here in Philadelphia, and she was talking about, the prisons as being a starting point for abolition. And when you start to follow the ways that the prisons are connected with all these different sectors of life in the state, you realize that all of these things are connected. If you were to start with prisons, you would end up having to dismantle so many of those other institutions and sectors of society. She made the case with farming, and it was kind of brilliant. She walked us through agriculture and big agricultural industrial farming, and how if you were to actually start to untangle the connection between farming and prisons, you would end up, rebuilding and entirely creating a new society, right? I think you could make the same case for the university, especially within the within the space of Philadelphia. Once you start actually untangling how the university is tied to all these other sectors of profit making, sectors of imprisonment and carcerality, it's pretty impossible to actually distinguish between the town and the gown, right? So that's just the point I wanted to make, in addition to what Chris was saying. And in our organizing work, we've really just emphasized consistently trying to support, local, typically Black-led activist movements who are, developing alternatives to policing, who are advocating for housing as a human right, who are, helping us imagine what an abolitionist world is. More often than not, our organizing is just a how do we uplift that? We ask ourselves that question, and then we go from there. And at this point, because we've been around for a few years and we've had the generosity, that Chris mentioned, extended to us by existing organizing groups in the city, we've been able to establish what are some pretty real, I think, authentic, kind of partnerships and alliances with groups outside of campus. And that's kind of more often than not where we start our work from. Although, that being said, we got to get these 120 cops off campus. I mean, that's a ridiculous number. Plus they're militarized. They have access to all kinds of resources. And those resources are deployed against the people of West Philadelphia more often than they're deployed against, for anything to do with pen safety, right? And that needs to be noted too. And we put in our manifesto, decriminalizing Blackness, poverty, and protest as kind of our big, under our heading decriminalize. Those were the three things that we knew that the UPPD were responsible for criminalizing in our neighborhood. So just adding a little more context to what Chris was talking about there.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So it's interesting, Alejo, I think when we're talking about sort of urban colleges and universities and the way that they can sort of conceal or even veil, right, the extent to which they do have this embeddedness, usually through the property accumulation and ownership, whereas a place like Ann Arbor or even Ipsy, right, the institutions here are deeply a part of that, and it's very apparent to everyone, right? You can't go anywhere in Ann Arbor without seeing the Block M, all over the place, or seeing folks who have graduated from here or currently work here. And so the situation is a bit different, but also very similar. And again, I'm wondering even how those challenges have sort of come your way with a place that has such a deep allegiance to or reverence for an institution, as a public and a place that people are invested in when these types of things are arising. And there's probably almost like a conflict of interest that you have to sort of navigate and deal with in working with community.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have the opposite problem. I abhorred being part of the university because I felt like I was upholding its genocidal and settler racist history, and so actually I kind of got thrown into organizing in the union and in my workplace, so to speak, with the strike actually. So
Mm,
in many ways, I have a kind of opposite sense of like, this is not what I want to be a part of, right? And that's a maybe a tension that a lot of us have. You know, I did most of my stuff, most of organizing that I did before since like 2008 when the Porter in Chief Obama was around, was fighting against deportations, right? And then did a lot of like prison abolition work in the wake of the 2016 prison strike here in Michigan as well. And so 2020, when 2020 hit, and like so many comrades just like kind of there's a kind of coalescing around the uprisings, like we got to fight also uh, against this university, but within it, right? Insofar as we have leverage as workers, right? Because as Chris and Jakes were saying, it's such a huge part of. I mean, in Arbor, it's an outsized role, as you're saying, Charles, right? In terms of the role the hospitals play, the amount of money that Ann Arbor brings, the hospitals bring for Ann Arbor, right? I mean, with the games, the football games, um, I don't think I've gone to a single football game, but in any case, many people go to these things, right, at the big house or whatever. And that's where policing is, right? Policing is at the hospital, and policing is police is at the hospital, and police is at the stadium, right? And that's what the university spends $32 million. I actually went to two soccer games that they showed, Jake, but not football games. Well, a different kind of football. Anyway, um, so yeah, I mean it's different in some ways because of the impact of the university is much clearer, and yet Ann Arbor, kind of gives this the spiel, right, of being this nice, liberal town, progressive town, and therefore things, oh, we're not like Philadelphia, right? Or we're not like what
mm,
happens in other towns in the United States, right? And there you have it, right? I mean, with Ara and what happened in the wake of Ara, uh, current Mayor Taylor said it was just tragedy, but it was not a tragedy of racism. He said, right, and sort of
mm-hmm.
brushed it off the side, right? And so I very much agree with the fact that we have to make it clear that obviously this is still part of America, right? With three Ks, that is, and that the kind of cultural geographies that Jake was alluding to through Ruthie Gilmore are lead back to the university as well, right? And therefore to its police department, which if you look at actually what the campus police does is most of their activities concern sort of property based activities, right? And this is by their own admission, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you know how to get the data from their website, you can see that most of the crime logs that they have logged on their own activities of their own activities since like basically in the past decade or so are related to property, right? And policing who goes where and so on and so forth, right? Including undergrads, but also of course community members, people that are have a different kind of home situation and so on and so forth, right? And so I think it's important to also think about the kind of anomalous alliances that we can build across the so-called campus, quite porous walls, to increase our power, right? But at the same time not rejecting, as I think Chris was alluding to before, the university as a site of experimentation, right? That can be used to kind of catapult abolitionist experiments
Mm,
beyond, right? So it's sort of there's a sort of somewhat of a tension, right, between saying we can use this as a site of experimentation, but also and not without the kind of anomalous alliances across the walls, because people are already building this world out there as well, right? To use that poor
mm-hmm.
metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that's kind of what we're trying to do within the structure of the union, and using that leverage to do that within the union, in our current campaign cycle, which maybe you can talk a little bit more about in a second.
Yeah,
But
so
yeah, it's vital.
I want to build on what you're bringing in with regard to data, right? So I think that often that's one of the most sort of elusive aspects of this work, especially with how universities sort of conceal, right, all of the things that can be found in the data. But GEO is able to sort of take on this data exercise, which I think is amazing and tremendous. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you all have been sort of engaging your own sort of research project in order to make sure that that data can be publicly available and sort of also understood and contextualized for folks who maybe not as quite have the same levels of data literacy.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, this is a direct result of our strike, which got shut down through the court system, through the criminal injustice system, through an injunction, because it turns out it's illegal to strike in Michigan. if you're a public worker. In the wake of that, the university gave us a task force, which Charles can talk maybe a little bit about, or maybe not. I don't know, Charles. In any case, it's widely known that the task force, as far as task force goes, was complete bullshit and completely useless in many respects. And so we actually did not get not even like minimal information as to what it is that how it is that campus policing works at the University of Michigan, right? Which was maybe nominally one of the so-called data transparency objectives of the Advancing Policing Task Force, or I think it was actually called Advancing Public Safety Task Force. But let's just call it Advancing Policing Task Force for now. To not and it turned out that that task force did not even give us the most minimal kind of data to actually learn any more about how it is that policing works. But it turns out that if you go to the University of Michigan's police website, they have, a crime log, what they call a crime log of all of their activities that they at least log on their website. It's not particularly accessible, but, with a little bit of coding, you can get access to all the things that they do on a day-to-day basis going back to 2001, right? So now here we have, as part of our abolitionist research, 20 years of data of campus police, their activities. And we also have, because the police also gave us this information, but didn't give it to the task force, it turned out, spatial data, geodata, right? So you can actually map what it is that they're doing according to their own standards and where it is that they're doing it, right? And so you can see, of course, if you look at our website, which is abolitiongeo.org, the radius is basically a 2+ mile radius centered in campus, which is most of Ann Arbor, right? A huge part of Ann Arbor. And through that data, you can see that, like I said earlier, most of the things that they do are related to property, traffic violations, and drug alcohol things, right? So the kind of version of so-called safety they sell us doesn't actually match with the things they tend to call safe, right? We get these emails periodically at the university saying, "Oh, look, we found this." It's often like a black man with a hoodie walking around campus, right? And then we get a crime alert, right? Every month. Obviously, that's not what they do most of the time, right? Most of the time, what they're doing is pulling people over for traffic stuff and kicking people out of university buildings, and like just logging things that get stolen, like bikes, which of course they never recover anyway, right? So it's really important to kind of visualize that and to show what it is they're doing with a $33 million budget, right? And asking people, staff, students, is this keeping you safe, right? Is this what they're selling you when they talk about safety, right? Is this keeping us as workers safe too, right? Within the union language, because ultimately we want a safe workplace, right? That's something that we can bargain over, right? And so the framing of policing as a safety issue, the framing of policing as a safety issue related to labor and as a broader public health issue that involves the entire community within and beyond campus, is a public health issue, right? And the university says this much, right? Its own researchers says this much, right? And so if the university recognizes that it's a question related to safety and it's a question related to public health, and we can show it through data, at least we can say this is something we can fight over as workers, and this is something that we get to bargain over because it relates directly to our conditions of our contract, right? So that's at the merely argumentative level. Of course, we have to show this in the streets. We have to show this with mass mobilizations, with mass organizing, and so that's kind of what we're building up to. And what Geo comrades have been building up to since 2020 and our relative defeat of our strike, right, through the injunction. But yeah, data is central to that story because it gives us the weapons, the arguments, right, that we can convince ourselves, we can convince others and say, look, this is what you're doing with the money. Obviously, that's not enough. You need arguments, but you also need mass mobilization, mass power, which go hand in hand with some of this data that I was mentioning. So it's vital. It's vital to do that research.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alejo. And turning to Jake and Chris, I know that's also like a big component, right, of just like understanding the narrative and the story and the history of some place, that's got its own relationship to as you mentioned, not just municipal police, but also campus police and multiple privatized campus police forces in a relatively small area, in the city. And so I'm wondering if you can also talk about, sort of you all's work and the campaigns that you kind of been working on the last couple of years that have both been sort of hyper specific to the University of Pennsylvania, but then also had to work across these additional university boundaries that are having a similar disparate impact in West Philadelphia.
I'm gonna let you go lead off here, Jake, as we're coming up on time too.
I think we definitely have had to work with other campuses. I mean, Drexel's campus, like geographically, more or less bumps up against Penn's campus, and we share. I'm sure that their police are sharing information with each other all the time. We certainly share and show solidarity with one another. And one of the reasons that's important is because it alludes to this place that they call University City, quote unquote, right? And it's the creation of a new neighborhood that's superimposed on neighborhoods that predated it, namely the Black Bottom neighborhood, which I'm sure that you've probably mentioned in other spots, Charles. But through this creation of an artificial neighborhood called University City, these universities are sort of working together to change the face of Philadelphia, change what Philadelphia looks like, who gets to be in Philadelphia, who gets to belong there, how much money you have to make in order to live there, right? Like very real issues for people who are living in these neighborhoods right now. And historically, that's like sort of surfaced through this idea of the University Science Center, which was like a multi-body project that included Drexel, that included UPenn, that included the city, that kind of set out to use the city to invoke eminent domain and kind of bulldoze this neighborhood, the Black Bottom and Powelton and Mantua to some extent, and kind of remake it to expand what the university services could offer through this idea of like the science center, right? And anyway, I guess what I'm getting at is that when you ask about multiple campuses and the importance of like cross campus solidarity, it is all just kind of like you follow the harm that the university does, and you're very quickly led to having to build solidarity as someone who's like trying to resist that harm and like reduce that harm. So we've worked with Drexel because historically Drexel has been as much as part of the problem as Penn is, and there are people on Drexel's campus who know that, who see that, and who want to work with us to fight it. And I guess one of the main campaigns that I'll share a little bit about that's kind of come to the surface through that cross-campus work is the campaign to save the University City townhomes, which has been renamed by the current occupants as the People's Townhomes because they are rejecting this concept of the University City. So the People's Townhomes, which is low-income housing. And we emphasize low-income housing, not affordable housing, which has a kind of ambivalent meaning, but it's low-income housing a few blocks away from Penn Central Campus, a few blocks away from Drexel Central Campus, but very much within this neighborhood that has now been, sort of renamed University City. And this is some of the last low-income housing. This is like some of the last places where poor people can live in this neighborhood. I mean, point blank, right? Like gentrification has changed the demographics of that neighborhood so drastically that people, really the only people who are able to live there are people who are, kind of grandfathered in, own their properties, or are part of this, state-funded low-income housing, right? State-subsidized low-income housing. And because of the various ways that low-income housing gets built by private developers in the United States, their 40-year sort of obligation to maintain low-income housing at this site came up at the end. Sorry, the 40-year period ended, right? And I think it was 2022. So just recently, or maybe it was 2021, the contract ended. The developer decided to sell the site, even though it's Section 8 housing, low income, it's still privately owned. He's put the site for sale. And of course, in the past 40 years, the what was what he purchased for, I think, like $80,000 or $90,000 is now, worth in the hundreds of millions. So it's an extremely desirable piece of property. And so we've, organized with the residents of the townhomes and with Drexel folks and with community members who are just interested in supporting to preserve low-income housing at this site. Underlying all of that is an idea that seems sort of antithetical to the way that the university operates currently, which is that housing is a human right and guaranteed housing should be for all people, and low-income housing should be a guarantee in neighborhoods, especially in neighborhoods where people have been living their whole lives and have raised families and children and that kind of thing. And if you follow the history of that neighborhood, these same folks who raised their kids and sent their kids to public schools, those public schools are now being removed for university development, university stimulated development. They're losing their community centers, libraries, and that kind of thing. So you have this situation where this is really some of the last space for real community for the Black and low income and people of color that live at this site, right? So I'll kind of wrap it there. Just say that, one of our central campaigns as abolitionists has been about housing over the past couple of years, and just sort of like recognizing that that has been one of Penn's biggest harms and Drexel's biggest harms to the community, is displacing people and dispossessing people of their homes. And so we've made that more of a central tenet, even if it may not read as necessarily dealing with policing directly. But of course, as Alejo was alluding to, we know that the policing comes in as a way to secure that property, to kind of make it appear a certain level of desirable for developers, right, to change the face of that neighborhood. So the policing always comes in and is tied to it. But really, that's been something that we've been working on. I just wanted to get that in there before I have to go. So let me throw that out there, and I can pass it to Chris if he has anything to add.
Thanks, Jake. We appreciate your time and for all that you've added to this conversation. And so we look forward to talking with you more, in the future. But have a great holiday if we don't talk to you beforehand, and I'll definitely see you on the streets.
All right, thanks, Charles, and it was great meeting you, Alejo. Peace, Chris.
I really appreciate Jake laying that out as he did, because I think that has been one of the, as we, we're, focused right now on the People's Townhomes campaign. And one of the challenges has been about the sort of like preset narrative, mainstream narrative around abolition or this like idea of defunding the police, that it is in some ways only, or try to be narrow, this response to the police brutality or the behavior of police, when much of what animates our critique, what animates our organizing, is about policing as a mechanism of capitalist control, right? And how that influences everything, right? So like, as he's talking about the people's townhomes, and this transformation of the Black bottom into the liberal, multicultural, diverse university city, right? And this with the research centers and this idea of like innovation. Someone tweeted me, I'm picking up the townhomes, and they said, well, why would you put residential within the middle of a university research lab? But that is in terms of public narrative, right? It gets into this question that I think is it's certainly the beginning to an abolitionist approach, is what is the best and highest use of land around us? And I think there's an abolitionist answer to that question, that even it supersedes how we think of, policing, right? As Alejo mentioned, we have this idea of security, which is a misnomer for safety, which in safety is sort of like a misnomer for the ways that, capitalism limits and works against community self-determination.
Yes.
So it's like, I think as we've 2 years to about 3 years in, this question, particularly because not only this idea of university city is also a linchpin within the city's idea of transformation, the sort of like move from direct industry into eds and meds, knowledge-centered economic innovation. and that's what they have their bet on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's seeing these connections through these systems, right? And just to even make it more specific, we talk about like cross university, connections. So the current president of Drexel University is John Fry. John Fry was the director of real estate and services for Penn throughout the 90s. During that time in which the research says, and certainly fact check me, is the displacement in West Philadelphia was accelerated at a point that has never been before, right? And Drexel loved him so much they made him the president of the university, and now he's working alongside Brandywine Realty Trust in a $3.5 billion transformation of a certain section of West Philadelphia that the developers call Schuylkill Yards. We might call it like Mantua, right near the bottom, that sort of area. So like all these things are interconnected. So I think like it's also one of the challenges that we see is how do we get to those larger questions, right? I think people try to reduce it. Like certainly, yes, we want to abolish the police, right? But in terms of how we, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore might say, abolish the conditions which created police and prisons as an answer to whatever, you know what I mean? Like we want to abolish that common sense as well. And how do we get towards that is also a challenge of how universities produce knowledge. You know what I mean? So it's also a question of like we got this guy on campus, Richard Burke, who was approved by the Institutional Review Board to do research, which has now spread all over the country and probably in even more other countries about the algorithm induced safety, where and it's real to the point where like prison and parole boards are deciding based upon these algorithmic scores whether someone can come home. You know what I mean? So that is approved, that was grant funded, that was celebrated by the university. So it's also about how universities are producing knowledge that are reinforcing both prisons, policing, militarism as a common sense strategy for our world. So it's the groundwork of how we build abolitionist movements, but also that mapping of how the university produce knowledge, university produce real estate and all that sorts of design is impacting our cities, impacting the livelihoods of low income, Black communities, indigenous communities, like all those things, right? And this can't be solved. And I'll say this is my last point. This is not going to be solved by no new memorial, no new statue, no new symbol. And I know university administrators may be watching this or something like that. And I just want people to get out of this symbolism and that we can get into the concrete material ways in which we see accumulation by dispossession happening all around us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I wish we had like a whole nother hour because we're like really cooking with grease at this point with some really important stuff. Alejo, I want to bring you in here, and then I'll kind of conclude with a final question. But just your thoughts as we're having this conversation, as Chris and Jake were mentioning.
Yeah, no, I mean, what Chris said is exactly right. I mean, the moment you start to pull that string, right, which is just one side of accumulation, accumulation both in the sense of accumulation by dispossession and accumulation through exploitation, because we're also workers at the university, I should add too, right? You start pulling in that string, and of course, it's as if the entire structure of racial capitalism kind of begins to unfold in some ways, right? Like as Chris was saying, the university is a site of accumulation of knowledge that is producing things like predictive policing in LA. Of course, the LAPD Stop LAPD Spying Coalition in LA has done a lot of amazing work to kind of like show the ways in which these algorithms seem to naturalize and mystify how you're just reproducing the same kind of outcomes, right? In neighborhoods in LA. And I think one challenge for us is to not merely just denounce what happens here, right? The question is, are there weapons that we can sharpen for abolitionist struggle, right, as well? In these kind of anomalous alliances beyond the porous walls of the university, as we've been talking about, are there weapons, right, here, if any, right, that we can stash and use, right? Are there ways in which we can develop abolitionist algorithms? Some comrades I know were developing, in 2020, for example, sort of like they use facial recognition software to identify cops, right? For example, because they had taken off their badges, and so in Portland, they had taken off their badges, and we're kind of using those weapons against the police, right? So I think there's kind of an opportunity as well, in some regards, a very dangerous one perhaps, because then you get comfortable with that kind of stuff, and then you say, well, I'm just publishing some papers, right? And then I'm just like going to some talks, right? And so I think that's one challenge and one danger is to think of the university as a site of struggle and as a site of experimentation, as Chris was saying, um, and to begin to kind of slowly pick away and like, take the thread and pull the thread, and you realize it's a nexus of how land works, land expropriation works. I mean, the hospitals here are very important as well, right? And the kind of carceral police connection we found was very important. Most calls that police get at the University of Michigan are in the hospital. They are working for the hospital. A lot of its money is being spent at what's happening in the hospital and emergency rooms and so on and so forth, right? And so I think there's still a lot of alliances that could be forged with the nurses, with people that work in the hospitals. And I think that's the work of abolition anyways, trying to find these kinds of anomalous alliances to change it all, right? To abolish and transform everything. Because that's really all we can do, right? It's not just about getting the cops on campus if we're going to get like private cops, right? Or if we're going to get, so we have to build alternative institutions, right? That also will replace life affirming institutions, that will replace and displace these kind of death making institutions, right? And that involves transforming the campus, transforming the university, transforming society as a whole, and not just the United States either, right? If we're gonna go all the way, right, we're gonna be internationalists, as so many of our comrades say. Right. And that's a challenge, right? And so we got to think about concrete ways of doing that, and the university is a site to do that. I mean, obviously the universities are very much linked across the world. I'm sure UPenn has interests elsewhere, right? And so it seems like insurmountable, but that's the stakes are very high, right? Very high. So should our struggle, yeah.
So I've appreciated so much about our conversation, both in terms of its beginning and kind of where we're finding ourselves now, and I always think about the tall order, right, or the asks upon abolitionists are never those that we ask of society and its existing institutions, right? But I think it still leaves sort of this elephant in the room, right, of like, well, what is it that we're reimagining, or what is it that we're hoping for? And I think, for listeners, that's going to be an important question to sort of hear from folks who are working towards, a different version of the world in which we live. And so I'm sort of drawn to, of course, the work of Robin D.G. Kelley and this sort of idea of freedom dreaming and radical imagination, in so much as what we understand is the function of radical imagination is so that we know what to build, not just what to destroy. And so I'm wondering, as we're rounding out our conversation, if you all, having been engaged in this work, can kind of articulate what you sort of imagine when we talk about like the abolition of the college and university, and what does that mean to you? What is the sort of world that exists with the university either functioning completely differently or not functioning in the way at all that it does at present? If you were to sort of articulate that freedom dream or that sense of radical imagination that makes anew this thing that obviously is right with challenges and problems, but also things from which we've been able to benefit.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question. I think for me in the short term, I mean, it's trying to stay focused on the short term and what we're doing here right now, and seeing the opportunities that are here now, right? And so I think that part of the challenge is kind of connecting the freedom dreams with the material reality we encounter ourselves in, right? And being able to make those converge in some sense, right? And so for us right now, or at least for me, there's some real possibility that we might push for something like, unarmed non-police response in our campus, in our campus, and in probably broader in the broader Washington community and Ann Arbor community, right? And so on the one hand, you begin to see this as a kind of long-term struggle, right? Like it doesn't seem like, given the conjuncture, the forces of work right now, we're not going to be able to beat cops right now, right? We're not going to get them off campus. We're not going to abolish the university overnight. And so it's really important to kind of have a kind of long-term kind of strategy and how you're organizing with others, right? And so it's very important to kind of think about it in those terms, because we otherwise think, we got to solve stuff immediately, right? And then you fight with comrades and then stuff dissolves, right? And so the tension is between the freedom dreams and the kind of immediate conditions of our struggle, right? And kind of connecting those two, finding each other, forging anomalous alliances across these porous walls, um, to change it everything, right? And to change everything means that we live in a world in which, our horizon is not immediate extinction, right? Our horizon is one in which everybody has their basic needs met, right? In which the university is a site of collective knowledge production, that for in which we can dream about what it is that it means to be a human on the planet Earth, 4.5 billion years, right, of this Earth that we've gone to, evolve as a human species, and explore, and understand the universe as a whole, right? And the ways in which we can be with each other that are not subject to the processes of premature death that Chris was talking about, accumulation by dispossession, that makes the university a site of death, right? And its money, right, as a site of death, right? In Palestine and around the world, in Latin America, with different processes of extraction in a broad sense, right? And so I think to change that, we need to imagine radically what it is that we want, but also be materially focused and located within current struggles, and see how it is that we can ally each other, for the long term, for long struggle.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
Chris.
and thank you, Alejo. That was wonderful. I know. So my frame is usually when I hear those types of questions, it sparks my library side of like, I know I would grab this, I know I would grab that, and I know I would start here. In terms of, because I do agree, and I think Crystal Strong had this way of saying we cannot concede the material present, right? As we imagine what's possible, right? There are some things that we can begin, and I think about what enriches my sort of like a radical imagination towards what's possible, right? One, off the top, I would go Sonia Vazquez Borges' study of the PAIGC, Cabral and Cabalistas, their idea of militant education, education for liberation during the revolutionary struggle. Seeing the ways that they built, like schools, right, in the bush, and the types of curriculum context that's about understanding what is needed and the skills you need for the here and now in terms of the immediate struggle, the revolutionary struggle of now, but also upholding that this work is unfinished and we will need you to imagine what's ahead of us, right? So as an educator, I'm incredibly grounded in that. And not only is the work that I do with Police Free Penn, but the work that I do with Black Lives Matter at school on a national level, where we're trying to push a lot of this information into the K-12 system, is also there. And second, I would go to San Francisco State, Third World Studies. I know my homie, brother, comrade of ours, Jason Ferreira, is finishing up a new book talking about the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State and the way that they reimagined, right, what higher education could be. And then also in that, right, is also the story of how that was compromised, right? And the challenges of institutionalization, which in some ways compromises the sort of like abolitionist radical imagination. So we also got to educate ourselves there, right? And then a last one, a really hopeful one that if I knew the language, I could probably be deeper into, but I don't, is the Chilean student struggle. It's amazing to me to see the Chilean, and reading about Chilean student protests of the early 2010s, 2012, right, and thinking of how we reimagine education to the point where we get into 2023 or 2022, and they have the idea of a whole new constitution for the country, right? I think there's something that we must learn from that, of like the scale of how we see what we're doing and the ways that we have to collaborate cross sectors, and that imagination fuels like what's possible. So like the Chilean student movement is also somewhere I would go to think about an answer to that question. But in general, what I say is, staying grounded in study, open up the little insurgent spaces that we can. And folks might know I'm familiar with a couple. So I'm the program director. I uphold the Paul Robeson House and Museum, which is, a museum that understands that lifts up the legacy of Paul and Islanda Robeson, but also is like, for me, a workshop within the Black radical tradition. I might not put that in the grant application, but you get what I'm saying. And the Philadelphia Student Union, right, which is a space which is working alongside young people to teach the skills of organizing activism, to have their lead their own organizing experiments and campaigns. So it's critically it's critical that we're in all those spaces. And I'll leave with just like a quote from Tony K. Bombara, someone who spent time in Philadelphia, who I come back to often, right? Who also has this tradition. If you go back to the Sikh program at CUNY, or CCNY, I don't know if those are two different spaces, but there's a lot to be read about her tradition, right? She says, I became acquainted with folks who demonstrated that the real work was creating value in the neighborhoods, bookstores, communal gardens, think tanks, arts and crafts programs, community organizer training, photography workshops. Many of them had what I call second sight, the ability to make reasoned calls to the community to create protective spaces wherein people could theorize and practice toward future sovereignty, while at the same time watching out for the sharks, the next wave of repression, or the next smear campaign and preparing for it. That's the work I do pretty much every day in various different ways. It might look like a photography workshop one day. It might look like a lecture at the Robeson House, an artist talk. But all together, it all adds up into that work. And that's, what fulfills me. So it doesn't feel like, oh my God, this is how all this labor with the world. It's just like, hey, I feel good about it. And I feel like I'm surrounded by a beloved community, and we're working towards something together. And I can sleep well at night. People be
That's
like, you
real.
don't sleep. I'll be like, I do. Just I'm my days aren't busy, they're full.
Yeah, that's an amazing place to end, Chris. So thank you both for your time, for your energy, for all of what it is that you are doing, continue to do in community with others who are committed to this work. Just for our listeners, where can they find out more about your organization, the things that you have going on, resources that you may have available? That would just be helpful.
I'll do the short, John. I'll say Police Free Pen on Instagram is probably where we're most active, but we're also on Twitter. We have a Facebook as well. You just look up Police Free Pen. Save the UC Townhomes is where just one member within the larger coalition of that work that is, resident led. SaveTheUCTownhomes.com. I'll start with those.
Yeah, so folks can follow Geo3550 on Twitter or on our website, geo3550.org. Also abolitiongeo.org, which plays with, of course, the abolition geography, but it's mostly a site about our working group, our caucus, rather, our committee within Geo, the Abolition Caucus. You can also look up the Coalition for Envisioning Our Safety, which is a coalition that we signed on to here in Ann Arbor that's fighting for unarmed non-police response in our county. And we hope to get the University of Michigan to give up some of its multi-billion-dollar endowment to help support that in our current campaign with the union. And yeah, that's more or less it. Glad to be here. Really awesome conversation. Hopefully this will continue to spark other thoughts and other anomalous alliances beyond whenever this gets posted somewhere. And thank you so much for bringing us together, Charles.
Awesome. My pleasure. Well, thank you all both. And again, thanks to Police Free Pen, to GEO. And we look forward to continuing to host these important conversations in community with those who are committed to reimagining higher education as a life-affirming institution. Thank you for tuning in to the Police Free Campus podcast. I'd also like to thank the National Center for Institutional Diversity and the Anti-Racism Collaborative's Research Community Impact Fellowship, whose generous support made today's production possible. For more information about the Police Free Campus project, or to find resources about reimagining a world without police, visit our project website at policefreecampus.org. If you're interested to learn more about the work at the Campus Abolition Research Lab, consider joining our mailing list by visiting our website at campusabolition.org or following us on Twitter at campusabolition. We really, really, really appreciate y'all rocking with us, and we hope to continue to produce content that helps make new worlds possible. So be sure to tell your friends about us, and don't forget to share, like, and comment wherever you're listening to our podcast. Until next time, study, struggle, and peace.